Lopez, Deputy Director of the Global Diversities and Inequalities Research Center. The director, Louise Ryan, she's on research leave at present. She'll be back very soon in January. So I'm sure many of you will have the opportunity to, those of you who have not met her yet, you will have the opportunity to meet Louise very, very soon. She's the leader of the center, and she's now doing very interesting research work. So we both, Louise and myself, we both lead this center, the Global Diversity. You've got lots of links that Anna very quickly has copied and pasted in the chat. Have a look to those links. Many of you are already familiar with the center, and you have presented work here, or will be presenting that very soon. So today I'm welcoming you because I know you are not interested in listening to me, but to Sebastian's wonderful presentation about trans and non-binary Latin American migrants in London. This is about the research he's doing. I'm going to introduce a bit his event, and then he will start his presentation. Before I do that, I just want to remind those of you who are attending this event or this seminar series event for the first time, we will listen to Sebastian first or his presentation. You can, while he's doing his presentation, you can write your question in the chat. Please mute all your mics. I can see everybody has muted the mics. And then at the end, we will be able to have a chat with him, pose our questions, and even have a bit of discussion among audiences and the presenter about particular topics that may have been addressed and we want a bit more explanation about. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce him and the topic he will be talking about today. So Sebastian, he's a fairly new member of staff. He will discuss today about his ongoing research exploring the experiences of trans and non-binary Latin American migrants in London. This is an extraordinarily interesting topic. This qualitative study uses innovative methodologies such as walk-in interviews and examine this data using a psychosocial and intersectional lens, asking participants to discuss their migration motives, sexual and gender resocialization, their participation in queer Latin American spaces and communities, challenges and opportunities in living in London, etc. Sebastian, as I said, is a fairly new member of staff. He is senior lecturer in psychology at university, is a social and LGBTQI plus psychologist, and his research interests include gender, sexuality, and language. So thank you. Thank you, Sebastian. Also, he will talk about his latest book, Non-Binary Gender Identities, The Language of Becoming, which has been recently published. So thank you very much. The floor is yours. And yeah, thank you, Sebastian.
Thank you so much, Maria, for the lovely introduction. So yes, my topic for this research is trans and non-binary Latin American migrants in London, an invisible population. So as you mentioned, I am a senior lecturer in psychology at London Met. I started about a year ago, which actually feels like 3 years ago because I have been involved in a number of committees and groups within the university, and I've gotten very involved. But most of my teaching is on social psychology and qualitative research methods. And I see that many of my students are here today because they're very interested in my research and want to hear more. So it's really lovely to see you all here. And as I mentioned, I recently helped kind of found the Gender and Sexual Diversities Research Group, which does it within the Global Diversities and Inequalities Research Center as a steering committee member, and I'm also the co-lead of the LGBT Staff Network. So today's presentation is of course about the research I just mentioned, but before I get to this ongoing research, I will be talking about my positionality as a researcher, talking a little bit about the expectations of today's event and how I would like this session to go. I'll talk about the current stage of this research, the literature background that has led to this research, a little bit on walking interviews as a innovative method for data collection and qualitative research, the next steps that I will be taking in this research, and then there will be some time for feedback and discussion. As Maria said, you can post your questions on the chat, although I really can't see the chat right now because I have two screens going on, but we'll get to them at the end. But if you have any questions in the meantime, feel free to, put them in the chat and we'll get to them at the end. So I would like to begin by talking about my positionality as a researcher. I think this is really pivotal in qualitative research and something that needs to be acknowledged and talked about, particularly when doing research amongst communities that one does not necessarily belong to. So obviously I come from psychology as a social psychologist, but most of my research draws from sociology as well as linguistics and sociolinguistics. So I use these fields and the lenses within them to analyze my data. An example of this is my latest book, as Maria mentioned, Non-Binary Gender Identities, The Language of Becoming, which was published in October of last year. So about a year ago, I was actually giving a book launch presentation at London Met. So I feel like every year I will be giving a talk from now on, because why not? But my lens is also informed by a queer and feminist position, both in my kind of research as well as my activism. And this is one that is trans-affirming and trans-inclusive at its heart. And in doing this, I often tend to do research that seeks to represent the plurality of queer people's lives and their lived experiences. I am myself part of the LGBT plus community. I identify as a cis man, sometimes as a queer man, or sometimes simply as queer, depending on the circumstance and depending on how nuanced I want to be when explaining my gender and sexual positionings and subjectivities within academia and in my personal life. And related to this research in particular, I am myself a first-generation immigrant from Colombia via the US. So when I was 16, I immigrated to the US. And then when I was 26, I believe, is when I moved to the UK. So my own experience and positionality as a migrant and as a queer person in many ways does inform and reflect this ongoing research. And I am very excited in some ways to explore these issues of migration or queer migration, as in many ways it reflects and informs on my own personal experiences, and is something that I've been wanting to research for a long time. So I'm quite excited to begin this journey in this new kind of area of research, which is, as I'll discuss today, quite new to me in some ways. So today's event is really about outlining my ongoing research on trans and non-binary Latin Americans living in London. What this research is not a debate on the existence of trans and non-binary people. and you may be familiar with some of the language that I will talk about today, which is great. If you're not familiar with some of this language, that is also okay. There will be plenty of time for questions. But again, this is not a debate on whether or not trans people exist and whether their lived experience is less valid or not than the experiences of cis people. So with that in mind, this is a respectful and this event holds a respectful and affirming stance towards gender diversity and gender plurality. So this research is currently at the, I wouldn't say the beginning stages, because some work has gone in the backstage, but no research has been collected as of yet. I was hoping to have some data to show you, but that wasn't possible due to several things holding the research process, but that's perfectly okay. That's part of the research process. But this research, fortunately, has been awarded some money, as you can see here, from the London Met's rescaling funding scheme. So I'm very thankful for the money that I've been awarded to start this research. And I was waiting on that outcome first before I started this research, partly because I will be paying participants for being for the participation in this study. So I wanted to wait for this before I submitted my ethical application. So that was submitted. It went through a couple of rounds, and actually, as of this morning, my ethics has been approved. So I will begin data collection very soon, possibly next week. So I'm very excited to actually begin that part of the research process very soon. Some of these funds are also being allocated towards hiring a research assistant via METEMS, which means that the research assistant needs to be a current student or a recent alumni of the university. And I've received a number of applications, and I will begin interviewing very soon as well. And hopefully I will have a research assistant going or starting in January. So that's also very exciting. And because I have been talking to my students as well about this research idea for the last couple of months, a number of students who are either LGBTQ plus or Latin American or Spanish speaking or interested in doing research have also contacted me. And I'm also in that process have created a small research group with some level 5 and level 6 students, mostly psychology students, some of whom will be getting placement credit for participating and contributing to this research. So I'm very excited about that too, because it feels like a small community of students and researchers who are interested in moving this research forward. And I'll talk about how important that is, because there really isn't much research on this topic at the moment. So on that note, what do we know about LGBTQ plus Latin Americans? Well, there is some knowledge out there, particularly drawing from LGBTQ plus or queer migration studies, most of whom are based in the US, which is unsurprising, particularly when discussing Latin American or the Latin American context, is unsurprising because of the proximity to Latin America, the US that is, and the long-standing history of migration that has occurred in the U.S. For many decades, for many reasons, and the ongoing migration that occurs due to political instability in the regions and other various reasons. And of course, the growing size of Latin American population in the US of approximately 60 million. Now, what do we know about Latin American people in London more generally? Well, not that much. So the experiences of Latin American migrants living in the UK are currently underexplored in social science research. There are some researchers based in Queen Mary University who have produced a number of very useful reports on Latin American populations in London. We do know, for instance, that Latin Americans are a relatively new and fast-growing population with an estimated size of roughly 500,000, and half of whom actually live in London, which is why this research is predominantly focused in London. Obviously, it's convenient because I'm also in London. We work for London Met, so doing research with that particular focus makes sense. In the past year, there's also been a new wave of migration, particularly from Colombia and from Peru. Given that these two countries, or the UK no longer requires visas for these countries' citizens to come to the UK. So that has increased the number of people who have come to the UK to visit and in some instances to stay. So, the number of people from Latin America coming to the UK continues to increase. So I think this is also a pivotal moment to continue doing research on this population. We do know as well that the largest population of Latin Americans in the UK tend to be Brazilians, followed by Colombians, followed by Ecuadorians, and a few other countries down the line. So it's definitely an area that needs to be explored further, just generally, not just looking at the experiences of LGBTQ plus people. We also know through this research that most Latin American migrants in London work in low-paid, precarious jobs, mainly in the cleaning or catering sectors. But there is also a great diversity of reasons why people migrate. Many individuals who have moved here also come to the UK via other countries in Europe. Especially, through Spain and through Italy. So there are various kind of migration paths that people have taken to come to the UK. But unfortunately, we also know that poverty and lack of access to education can leave people vulnerable to exploitation and wage theft. So again, this is a particular factor that would be worthwhile exploring in this research. Now, trans and non-binary people, I put this kind of brief umbrella definition here. It's not perfect by any means, but trans usually is the larger umbrella under which trans men and women, or simply men and women, sit under, and then also non-binary people, which may use other labels such as genderqueer, gender fluid to identify themselves. The overarching umbrella identifies people whose current gender or genders do not necessarily align with the gender they were assigned at birth. So we know that trans and non-binary people continue to experience stigma, discrimination, and marginalization in their daily lives. sometimes via overt forms of violence, harassment, and assaults, whether they're physical or verbal, as well as covert barriers such as limited access to healthcare, to education, and to other material resources. Some of these, of course, are in part due to cisnormativity, which is essentially the assumption that everyone is or should be cisgender, and that because of this, anyone that is not cisgender is inferior or less than trans and non-binary people. So this is kind of a larger system of oppression that can make the lives of trans and non-binary people more difficult, to navigate any kind of social, political, or educational system, and you name it. So all of these factors can increase the health inequalities and poor health outcomes amongst trans and non-binary people. So what I'm interested in, of course, is the intersection between these two communities. So again, the experiences of LGBTQ plus Latin Americans in the UK, particularly in London, are underexplored, as I have made the case for, and they're seemingly invisible in research. And this is especially the experiences of trans and non-binary Latin American migrants. So that's what this research is on. So there has been some research on gay men, gay Latin Americans in London. So a very recent study, a qualitative study as well, interviewed 14 Latin American gay men in London. This is a study conducted by Valenzuela in 2021. And what this study found is that the participants preferred London over their native cities and countries due to its anonymity, multiculturalism, and super diversity, and that many of them critique their native cities and countries for being too traditional, for being less anonymous and more homogeneous due to the small and familiar networks embedded within Latin American culture. And because of this reason, most of the gay men that Valenzuela interviewed tended to avoid Latin American culture, venues, and people when they lived or when they were here in London, or well, they are now in London. So the reason for this, Valenzuela argues, is that many of them see London as a gay haven. This is something that was taken from Binney in 2004. And this is the idea that there's an idealized location, mostly, metropolitan cities where queer life and queer representation tend to be more open and more visible. So for the participants, this idea of a gay haven allow them to hold a very strong connection to queer culture, venues, and other queer people in London, which Valenzuela argues that it aided in the process of sexual and gender resocialization. So what he meant by this is that this allowed them to diversify their sexual and gender practices by challenging normativities ingrained in Latin American culture. So subjects that tend to be taboo in many Latin American contexts, particularly religious ones. So the idea that heteronormative sex and gender and sexual roles, so the kind of ingrained machismo that can be associated with Latin American culture, and then the discussion or open discussion of sexual health. So as a result, for many of the participants, their identity construction tended to be as gay first and Latino second, meaning that the queer or gay identity and community tended to be more focused towards the gay venues, community, and so on, and that the Latino aspect tended to be secondary for many of them. Now, as I mentioned before, for trans and non-binary Latin Americans, this line of research, particularly in the UK, simply does not exist. So no studies have examined the experiences of trans non-binary Latin Americans in London. As I mentioned before, there are a number of US studies. So one of them has looked at the experiences of Latine, trans and non-binary adolescents in the US, but not all of them were migrants. So not all of them were kind of first generation people who had come to the US as adults or adults. Many of them were children of Latin American parents. But this research found that Latina transgender population adolescents experience a much higher rate of suicide attempts. But they also found that familial ties were associated with lower emotional distress. So this research, which I'm sort of drawing upon, but it's not necessarily entirely relevant, again, because not all of the participants were migrants themselves, suggested that cultural and familiar ties and acceptance may be an essential factor for trans and non-binary people. And this is somewhat contradictory or incongruent with the previous study that I showed, Valenzuela's, in that for them, the kind of traditional or the familiar ties to the culture were not as important for gay men. So this research, therefore, is a qualitative pilot study. And I'll talk about, I want to do later on a larger, perhaps quantitative study looking at LGBTQ plus more generally. And this is exploring the experiences of trans and non-binary Latin American migrants in London. So participants need to have lived in the UK or in London in particular for at least 1 year. I'm aiming to conduct 20 semi-structured interviews using this innovative method called walking interviews, which I'll outline in the next slide. And using a psychosocial and intersectional lens, I am aiming to explore things like their migration motives, their sexual and gender resocialization, and their participation in queer and or Latin American spaces and communities, as well as the challenges and opportunities of living in London. All of this as well with a focus on psychosocial support needs, including access to healthcare and the barriers associated with this, some of which may be linguistic in terms of, for migrants who come here and haven't, now I'm struggling with my English as I'm trying to say that, but haven't learned English in a way that allows them to navigate the healthcare system and other systems in the UK. So my research is therefore trying to answer the following questions. How do participants understand their migration histories in their context of their gender identities? what are the experiences of living in London, and how may these affect them emotionally, either the positive or the negative, and how do participants navigate their identities and experiences among Latin American communities and spaces in London, as well as among queer communities and spaces in London. Some of this might be quite similar to the previous studies that I showed before, but trans and non-binary people face additional barriers in accessing queer support systems that in many cases tend to be catered towards gay men rather than trans and non-binary or other queer populations. So a little bit on walking interviews, which I am in some ways new to, but I'm extremely excited to be using this methodology for my research. So a walking interview is simply a semi-structured technique, semi-structured interview technique in which the researcher and the participant walk together while the researcher is interviewing the participant. This method has primarily been used in fields such as geography, urban planning, anthropology, sociology, but very recently it has been used in the field of psychology, particularly in health psychology. So I haven't encountered yet any social psychological papers that have used walking interviews, but perhaps I haven't been searching properly just yet. But it is, if that's the case, a novel approach within social psychology as well. So this method is useful in many cases because it helps to dismantle the potential power differentials between the researcher and the participant. So one of the useful aspects that I've been reading about is that you're not constrained by the environment you're in, you're not facing one another necessarily, which can be, more collaborative, less intimidating, and it can allow for this meaning-making process to be more fluid. I mean, many of us like going on walks, and it's a way to generate new ideas and perspectives and so on. So it can be a window into participants' experiences, perspectives, and emotions. And what I particularly like about it is that we can incorporate the surroundings, in this case, London, as a place that can allow for new meanings to emerge. So it can elucidate participants' relationships, sense of belonging, and attachment to places. Again, in this case, London. And it can help us explore the role of the physical environment on participants' sense of identity and sense of self in this context, or in this new context for many of them, which is very relevant to the current research. So I am currently collaborating to a certain extent with two London-based organizations. One of them is CLAUC, which is the Coalition of Latin Americans in the UK. And they work for the recognition of Latin American ethnicity and improve access to healthcare and labor rights, as well as IRMO, which is the Indo-American Refugee and Migrant Organization, which advocates for Latin American people to live free from poverty and discrimination and to feel empowered to pursue their aspirations. So these two charities have been quite pivotal in the beginning stages of kind of coming up with ideas, and they're going to be very helpful, and they've already agreed to help with the dissemination of the recruitment process, and putting a sign up in their locations, and perhaps even encouraging people to participate in this study. These organizations have indeed noticed that there's a lack of information for queer Latin Americans, and and the sense that many of them don't really want to approach a Latin American charity because they feel that they won't understand their experiences. So many people, many trans and non-binary people would rather approach a trans and non-binary specific charity than a Latin American charity when seeking services. So there is potential for developing trans and I suppose queer inclusive resources for Latin American people who are seeking information after this research is completed, which would be really exciting. So what are the next steps for this research? Once ethics are approved, which again, they were approved this morning, data collection will begin. So hopefully next week, once I have translated all the documents, which I haven't yet, I was waiting for the ethics to be approved, I will begin data collection. The research assistant, as I mentioned earlier, will begin in January. So they will mostly be helping me in translating the interviews, helping conduct some of the literature review and expanding upon it, and hopefully with some of the data analysis, qualitative data analysis. Again, I haven't hired a person yet, and the ad is still up on MedTem. So if you are here and you're interested, or if you know someone who might be and speak Spanish as a primary language, and Spanish and Portuguese would be a bonus. Please do apply or encourage others to do so. I would like to do more public events and involve the community, both at London Met and at the aforementioned partner organizations. Of course, this research will aim also to produce a number of academic publications related to this research and to provide policy recommendations, including the need to incorporate Latin American and sort of trans-inclusive questions in surveys and in the census, for instance. So the census doesn't really include Latin American as an ethnicity, as a racial option. So that's something that many of these organizations are already fighting for, but showing the access needs for these communities can hopefully provide further evidence of the need to make these changes, for instance. And part of the rescaling application is aiming, as I mentioned before, this is a pilot study. I'm hoping to, once I have the results from this study and it's gotten a number of impact and so on and events, that I can apply for a larger funding opportunity looking at LGBTQ plus Latin Americans more broadly, using both quantitative and qualitative approaches. So that is really all I had prepared. So I am very thankful for the invitation and very thankful for your time. So if you have any questions, I will be happy to take them now. Thank you.
Thank you, Sebastian. That was fantastic. Can you hear me well? Because I've got my headphones just to capture all the information very well. Thank you. That was a very interesting presentation. And as I said at the beginning of this presentation, this is just so exciting and thought-provoking topic. And as you very rightly say, this is very under-researched. So I just want to hear what people say and write, and see if there is any kind of question to you And I also invite those who want to speak directly with Sebastian and pose their question to him to connect the mic or hit the raise their hand, so we can just set up kind of order in questioning. I really enjoy hearing about your choice of doing walking interviews and how they can be used. I'm reading Cherry Benson's comment and how they can be used to create links with plays. Very cool, creative. Looking forward to seeing your research. Let's see if there is a question directed to you. If not, I can just start. Sure. And I've got several questions, but the first one was in relation to what this colleague said. Let me just get the Cherry Benson said. I just wonder about these walk-in interviews. Why did you decide to go for walk-in interviews? I've done, and I'm doing walk-in interviews in my current research. So, I'm very interested, yes, in this methodology, in this technique. But I wonder, why did you choose to go for walk-in interviews?
I think for me, it was the fact that it was so London based. And I think incorporating that kind of environment, especially that new environment for many of them, can be a really exciting way of highlighting their migration histories and ways of understanding this new context. So, you know, when I started reading about this innovative technique, I just got very excited. So I've never done it before. So I would be really, you know, happy to go to talk to you more about your experience with them, and how that has been for you. But yeah.
Yeah, no, it is very interesting because at present, while people are just making up their questions, please raise your hand and also write your question in the chat. Meanwhile, I will just speak a bit longer with Sebastian. The walk-in interviews that we are now, I say we because Luis and I, we are doing that in the project we've got with Afghan and Syrians in the UK, and we did quite a good number of walk-in interviews, and we're planning to do walk-in interviews in our next project with Afghans in London, Afghan women in London. So this is very interesting to walk around the areas where those refugees live, but these areas that are familiar to them. So we went to parks, and then you just walk with them while you record what they say, and they feel very comfortable. And then you sit down in a coffee shop, and then you end up the interview in a. So I wonder that it's the same with you. You will try to facilitate a kind of discussion or conversation about how they feel in London, visiting places that are familiar to them. Is that what you want to do with that?
Yes. So we will go to places that we agree on, right, you know, before the interview. So we will map out actually the locations we're going to. Okay. This has been a long process too in terms of ethics, you know, ensuring that both of us, the researcher and the participants, are safe as possible. So we're going to agree on locations that, you know, are meaningful to the participants and that are also accessible, that have toilets nearby, that have places to sit in terms of, you know, if the participants are tired, and that are close to establishments in case there are any emergencies. Sorry, my cat wants to come into the office.
We can't see you though, Sebastian, because your camera went off, or at least I can't see you. Now you're on.
Yeah, I'm back. So yeah, I think part of it is ensuring safety, and part of it is also the kind of meaningfulness of the locations, especially as I mentioned, the meaningfulness of this new place that many of them are now considering their home.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's very good to just contextualize it under the idea of London as a home.
Yeah.
Tatiana is asking about walk-in interviews. When you walk with your participants, what about the body language aspect? Will you pay attention to that?
No, I won't be paying attention to it. I'm only analyzing the audio. You know, in kind of a, yeah, it would be very difficult to pay attention to body language and other details. I'm not doing a full ethnography that will capture, you know, body language and how people kind of move around. And so the observation aspect of an ethnography is something that I'm not doing. I'm simply analyzing the audio and the transcription of it, and the translation of it as well. So the research assistant will translate. Of course, I will have access to both, so there might be nuances that I might need to pick out in the analysis that, you know, when you translate, you lose so much meaning. So that I will be paying more attention to, but the body language, unfortunately, is a whole another area of analysis that I do not have the scope to analyze. But that's a very good question, Tatiana. Thank you.
So you are planning to conduct the interviews in Spanish and
Yes.
then transcribe and translate those
Transcribe
in English.
and translate.
Okay.
Yes.
I saw another question. How would you record your participants whilst walking? Obviously, I'm thinking of it in respect of how it can be recorded less formally.
Yeah, so I have some lovely equipment, so some microphones that can be worn, and the audio will be transmitted straight to my file, to my phone. So it's what I didn't want is for our hands to be busy, for safety as well, because then your equilibrium might be off, and it's easier if you're just walking and your hands are free. So it's something that can be worn. And that's how the data, the audio data will be picked up.
Okay. So you can see participants are quite interested in the methodology. How are you going to do it? How are you going to do the walk-in interviews?
It's most of my students, which I love.
Okay, that's wonderful. Cherry is asking, how long did the process of mapping out the route with participants take?
Sorry, I can't find it. How long did the process of mapping out the route? We haven't started doing that yet, so we'll see how long it takes, but that will be, you know, before the well, we negotiate the consent forms and all that. That will be part of the process. So hopefully it will be a smooth process. Maybe they'll have some, you know, some participants might be very upfront about where they want to go, but others, you know, might need some recommendations and so on. So this is something I'll have to negotiate on an individual basis.
Any other questions? Does anybody have any other question? No? So how are you going to recruit participants, Sebastian? Through the organizations?
So, through the organizations, through social media and snowballing, basically.
Yeah. So that would be like transsexuals, no? Or transgenders?
Transgender. So transsexual, it might be that some participants might still use transsexual as an identity label, but the widely used terminology now is trans or transgender. But this might be also culturally specific. In Latin America, you know, some people might still use transsexual or
that's why I was translating directly from
travestis in Brazil. Some communities still use this concept. So this will be part of the questions, you know, how do you identify yourself?
How do you identify? And when I was teaching gender sexuality, which I've done for many years, one of the main issues I had when explaining about transgender, transsexuality, trans whatever, I ended up just quoting this trans whatever, because was the terminology actually, because to begin with it was changing all the time, year
Changes
after
a lot,
year,
yeah.
depending on who you read to and what kind of bibliography you were reading. It varied. So if you were reading bibliography from the United States, it was called in a different way, massively. Different from if you read books and articles from Latin America, and different from other places. So how will you be dealing with this when, and I'm thinking now more than interviewing people, when you write about your research, what kind of terminology will you will have to do? You will have to add lots of notes,
Yeah.
footnotes explaining. No?
No, yeah, definitely. I think definitely we'll be asking participants what language they prefer to use. In my inclusion exclusion, which I have here in the slide actually, I am telling participants, or I'm recruiting participants who explicitly identify as trans and or non-binary. So
Right.
this is already set out, you have to, in order to participate, identify within this umbrella. And that might exclude people who may use other terminologies, but these are to a certain extent quite, I wouldn't say universal, but my experience with the Latin American community who is trans and non-binary is that these terms tend to be widely used currently.
Yes.
But of course, I'm asking them sensitively what language and what identity labels underneath this classification, let's say, they employ. And unfortunately, many of the kind of queer theoretical models that we have, they are Western theoretical models of identity and queerness in general. So I know that in many Latin American contexts, people may use other terminologies and other theoretical models. So I know in Colombia some new approaches called Teoría Marica, which is a reappropriation of a term that has historically been used against the queer community in the same way that queer has been used as a pejorative term towards LGBTQ plus people. So,
That's right.
It might be that in this process, this will be highlighted, and the dismantling of the Western identity models and how those have influenced other world places, and perhaps how those have been challenged or are being challenged in some ways and contexts.
Well, I think that would be very interesting to problematize
Yeah.
all these concepts and ideas, and just taking a bit of advantage of the fact that it's under-researched. So then people will start quoting you and your wonderful research just because you get there first. Someone, Alex, was asking if you will use triangulation in translating the interviews.
I suppose if I'm understanding the question correctly, I mean, I will be overseeing the translation. So I will be kind of going back and forth. And if the translation is not, I mean, translation will never be perfect. All the nuances within it are very difficult to capture sometimes. And it's even difficult for me. I mean, I left Colombia when I was 16, and every time I visit, sometimes I feel like I don't speak Spanish anymore because the terminologies have changed. And I mean, so much. So it's going to be, translation is not easy. It's a difficult, to capture all that nuance sometimes, which relates maybe to the next question, which I read in advance about
the idioms in Spanish.
Yeah, so that's going to be a difficult aspect and something to discuss as well in the papers or potential publications.
Yeah.
My cat's name, his name is Cuckoo, which is short for queer spawn. He's been a pest.
Okay. So is he or she? He. Cuckoo is a he.
He technically, but he goes by
Technically,
any
but you
pronoun.
never know. You never know. He may come up with a different terminology. Okay, great. No, that's fantastic. I've got a question, a more conceptual question. It's not going to be like very difficult. It's regarding the notion of invisibility and how this community, sometimes I find when doing research about them, sometimes I find that there is a kind of contradiction. And see if I can explain myself well. At one point in their conversation, now that you also pay attention to the narrative and the way they talk about their own experiences and stuff, they claim for visibility. Because of course, this community have been hugely and still are, hidden and visibilized and everything. But at the same time, it's funny in your research, I just noticed that they love London because of the anonymity. How they can just disappear. How we can all disappear, in the mass of people and not be easily recognized and just. But it's just funny how at the same time they're claiming we are all a bit of visibility and attention and recognition to our rights and everything. But at the same time, I think in your research is particularly important now that it's contextualized in London as a very special and multicultural city, how they love it because of this kind of anonymity it gives. So that idea, which I've been kind of thinking through for long period of time, I can say, since I did my research on Cuban homosexuals, has been, coming to me, this idea many times. I've heard them talking in interviews, or I've read some research about from colleagues, etc. So I wonder how, and now that it's, contextualized in London, which is, as I said, a special city, whether you've thought about it or whether you would be interested in exploring this kind of, no contradiction, but kind of unbalanced. Because before you answer, one of the beauties I find of paying attention to the narrative and the way people express and tell their stories is just also to pay attention to their own contradictions that we all, of course, have, and we all, of course, do when we talk. So I'm curious to know whether your views on that.
That's a very interesting point. I guess part of it is as you were saying, the getting lost in or not being noticed because, a metropolitan city where there are, thousands and thousands of people. And in many cases, in order to stand out, you need to absolutely look, a particular way. But even in London, sometimes we're on the tube and there might be someone wearing the most outrageous outfit, and we simply, go back to what we were doing because that's just what a city is about. So, I think that anonymity offers safety to a certain extent to many people, because it's, if you're not standing out as much as the next person, then, the risk of street violence and harassment might diminish slightly. So I think that's one of the factors that make a larger metropolitan city so appealing, is being able to just be one amongst the many. It also offers the opportunity to not be the only one who is visibly queer, and therefore there is a kind of safety in numbers effect to a certain extent. And that is related to visibility because, if there are more and more and more people who are visibly queer to a certain extent, whether it's in terms of gender or sexuality, then that also offers a certain level of, I see you, you're visible, and you are accepted for, whatever shape and form you come in. So yeah, I see sometimes the contradiction of that's a very interesting point. But I think maybe they go hand in hand rather than as opposing poles, particularly when it comes to safety.
Yeah. Oh, definitely. Let's see if there is any other question, and if not, I will. Regarding the participants living in London, Pamela says, you mentioned that the minimum time for them living here will be 1 year. Do you think 1 year might be not enough time for people to be immersed?
Yeah, that's a very good question and a good point, and that's something I consider quite a lot. I think 1 year is not enough to be fully immersed, but is enough to, in many cases, have made the decision to stay if you, let's say, overstayed a particular type of visa, to have made some connections, and to see London as a possibility. So part of also why that's so low is, I think, capturing and recruiting people who identify as trans and non-binary may be challenging, just generally. I mean, the population is a growing population, but it's still very small. And the intersection between trans and non-binary and Latin American makes that even lower. So yeah, that's going to be something to explore in the findings. I'm hoping that the sample size of 20 will capture enough nuances in that some people might have stayed here for a year, but others might have been here for 20 years. But the main criteria is that they need to be have been born in a Latin American country.
Oh, that's fantastic. Do we have any other question, or I just ask you my last one, Sebastian? I don't want to keep in you longer. If you, Andreas, if you find problems recruiting participants that meet the criteria of Latin American and trans and non-binary, could you be considering expanding to other cities?
We will see. We will see. I will love to keep it London-based, especially with the walking approach, so I can easily, go to North London, South London, East London, and so on. But yeah, we will see how I have 6 months to finalize the recruitment, so we'll see how things go.
Oh, wonderful. So I'm going to just ask you another question, Sebastian. That will be my last one. I could be talking with you for hours and hours about it. These people that you will be interviewing are coming from Latin America, which is, as we all know, quite patriarchal, conservative, cis normativity oriented, etc. So it will be more than a question, it's an observation. It will be very interesting to read in your research about all the differences they find with living in London, and how free they may feel, free, it's not very, but they may feel living away from those contexts. And with those contexts, I'm also referring to families. And that will be very interesting to know about the relationship in the distance with their transnational families living back, and what they tell them about their lives in the UK and what they don't tell them about their lives in the UK. That would be very interesting to know, because as I heard you, I think that will be the first generation of immigrants that you will be interviewing, like you. So, you know, people who just moved from Latin America to here in search of a better opportunities or a different context. So that will be very interesting to read about those kind of, you know, things that they tell to their transnational families about their lives, but also things that they don't tell because they may feel they're not ready yet to hear about that, or they may not be ready yet to share that information with them. That would be very interesting to see how they navigate and reconcile the two systems, I think.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think that, you know, we are capable of holding multiple identities at once, and what we disclose to certain people, particularly our family, might be very different from who we are amongst other places and other communities.
Yeah.
So I'm hoping that the contextual kind of location-based element of the interview will help in you know, gathering some of that data, which I hope it does. We'll see how it goes.
Yes, of course it will. It will, I'm sure it will. And I'm sure you will recruit enough participants in London. I'm sure that you will find enough people for your research.
Thank you.
Okay, folks, is there any other question that you want to ask Sebastian or share in the chat? No? No? Yes, Andreas. Okay. Okay, so we will wait for Andreas to write the questions chat. And where can we keep up to date with your research?
Oh yeah, that's a very good question. I'm hoping, you know, once I've got some data to present in the next couple of months, if not in the summer, to do another event like this and present some of the findings. So, you know, keep an eye out for events coming up, both within the center as well as the gender and sexuality research group.
Okay, so you are invited to present advances of your research next year in the seminar series and tell us how it went. Okay, folks, if there isn't anything else, we should let Sebastian go now and have some rest from this exhausting session. Thank you very much to all for attending today. Have a look to the events that we are organizing at the center. Some of them are from the gender sexuality group, but some others are not from those, and I'm sure they are very, very interesting too for you. We will be doing a symposium on women's violence in January and many other events. Just have a look to the website, and don't forget to register if you want to receive the link or attend in person in London. Thank you very much. And we will see you very soon around. Thanks. I will just stop the recording. Thank you very much to all.